Hey everybody, so this week I'm doing a colored pencil or sort of colored pencil style drawing in Procreate, which is a really great program that I'm sure many of you use that really gives a good sense of traditional drawing media. So it's a combination, of course, of some of what you can do digitally with only digital effects and some of what's able to be accomplished through colored line work. All right, so let's jump in. So one of the reasons why I wanted to do a colored pencil drawing in Procreate is I like the look of colored pencil or of linear line work, but I don't really like working with colored pencils. They're pretty laborious. You run through them very easily. The layering process takes a very long time. And so to create that sort of color line work, I thought, let's see if I'm able to accomplish that with some similar effect or with equal satisfaction working digitally. And I felt pretty good about this piece, and then there'll be a little follow-up piece without the process. So the idea here was, or the subject that I took was a figure, sort of like a goddess, alighting on mulch, right? Where I'm an avid gardener, and I've been sort of obsessed with mulch for a while. I'm pretty obsessed with things that are obvious and all around us and sort of essential to life that we never think about. And so mulch, of course, is ground cover, really of any type, but the most usual mulch and the most ecologically meaningful is like leaves or other things that plants cast off and end up creating a surface over the dirt or over the soil that helps to encourage biodiversity, retain water, or retain moisture. It improves water cycles. It allows for sort of forage, and it hosts sort of nurseries for certain kinds of insects and things like that. So the idea was that I would create a sort of nicely mulched forest floor, and you'd have some kind of goddess character, a nature figure, a nature god, alighting, sort of appearing. And, what is the connection that's being established here? Is this when the leaves are falling in autumn, and the goddess of nature appears and gives the kiss of life, the touch of life to the earth, whatever it is, sort of playing with connections between an allegorical nature figure and what I'm able to depict of nature. So at this point, it's all a pencil drawing, getting a sense of layout, getting a sense of directionality, where I want each part of the subject to be, working on these feet as sort of the protagonist. So we're not seeing the entire figure, we are only seeing that connection that's happening and playing that up. So the idea is that I have these layers of leaves that are moving out in concentric circles, and kind of like with a helicopter coming down, they're flying out of the way as if though she's hitting the ground with force. Whether it's magical or it's physical is sort of to be seen and to be determined in color and how I decide to draw it. But at this point, I'm figuring out how these leaves are sort of flying off the forest floor as her toes are reaching down to that center point. So you can see I am identifying some of those leaves that are popping up. I am figuring out what the textural difference and similarity is going to be between the flesh of this character, who is humanoid, of course, but not entirely human. So I'm allowing some exaggeration in anatomy, and there will definitely be exaggeration in color. And I'm figuring out what are the sort of shapes and trajectories that I want to take with my colored pencil lines. I'm doing that all in digital graphite pencil. So from there, still figuring out those shapes as they're moving around those central feet, throwing in the trees behind. And you can see that the trees are moving at angles away from those central feet as well. So I'm kind of leaving that to the imagination. Is her hitting the ground so strong that the trees are sort of bending back? Or is that how they're grown? Is this an ancient clearing in the forest that she's appearing at, and the trees have grown for thousands of years in response to her appearance? Leaving that open, and allowing for an extended narrative beyond the frame of the picture. So at this point, finishing some of the value range, getting the darkest darks, allowing for the lightest lights, sort of throwing that forest right into the background, and creating that, really identifying and clarifying that little star shape where her toes are hitting the ground, sort of an act of creation as she's reaching down to touch the soil underneath the mulch that has perhaps prepared it for her. In legend and myth, I'm really interested in sort of creation, origin, how nature acts as sort of a servant or a handmaiden to the divine. I think those can be really interesting and say a lot about human thinking, whether good or bad, but definitely of interest. So at this point, I've finished my graphite drawing, and I'm going in with green outlining. I'm using the Procreate pencil, which reads pretty much as a rough graphite pencil, or a bar of colored pencil, or just sort of a rough colored pencil. And so I'm working with green as my first color. You could call this Verdaccio, the Verdaccio technique. So old-fashioned painting technique, beginning with green and then building up into warm colors, sort of flesh tones and atmospheric coloration. So identifying and using sort of the best, or what I thought were the best sort of graphite areas in the template that I'd created, those big directional lines that I figured out with graphite, sort of choosing what I needed so that I'm not getting too messy with my line work. I'm identifying the difference between these layers of leaves so that has a real feeling of density, that they've been there, they have some power over the ground. They aren't just sort of a loose accumulation of tree matter. They are a real skin, almost like scales on a reptile or on a fish, that are being sort of pulled back by the force of this divine presence. So from there, or continuing to rather, differentiate between the texture of the skin and the trees and the leaves, identifying all those individual leaves that are going up into the air there, they're flying up and away. And at this point, adding in color. So I felt like the drawing was sufficient. Putting in some warms, you can see reds, oranges, some warm browns, yellows, warmer greens to add contrast to that primary sort of grass green. And the thinking here too was, how am I going to create an interesting color character for this entire picture? What is the overall atmosphere? This is something that could be happening secretly at night. Is this human skin, or is this a blue figure of some type? Is this a green figure? And the leaves, what am I going to choose for them? So all the leaves that you see flying away from her feet are in yellow. Of course, there's red there as well, some brown. The idea being these are leaves that are falling in autumn. At the time that leaves typically fall, that would be the overall coloration. And taking some of that warmth, putting it in the skin of the figure too. Also doing some blending. So a great thing about working digitally, and this applies to a lot of physical techniques too, is that you can blend so easily, and of course you can edit your errors. So taking some of those lines, blending them into something that feels more like soft flesh, and then redrawing lines on top of that. You can see that definitely in the soles of the feet. At this point, separating out the leaves and the feet as central characters from the darkness of the surrounding area. This could be nighttime when she's appearing. That, of course, is being highlighted by the luminance tool that I'm using. So great Procreate drawing tool. Something that you really can't quite do physically. Create that sense of kind of bleeding light in those lines, like neon light. And that's what I wanted to use for the tops of her heels there as she's floating downward. Adding some glare and highlight to those, sort of smudging those highlights in order to create an overall shine. And it also creates a sort of strong supernatural relationship between her feet and these primary leaves that are flying away and exposing that central star there on the ground. So at this point, I am really looking at how certain areas are rougher than I would want them to be. I want that overall texture, but I don't want it to be too raw. So I'm going through, laying in some additional colors, light areas, smoothing back some, adding in some overall layers of color in order to sort of wash it into one picture, which is something that you'll often do with colored pencil drawings. If you add like a layer of watercolor, you can fill in those white areas that sit between the actual pencil marks. And at this point, really working in small details. The overall color composition is done, highlighting and refining some of the anatomy, separating out those areas between the leaves, creating that little green neon around each of them, really reinforcing that sense that this is deep, heavy mulch, and then throwing in an additional pair of tattoos on the soles of her feet. So she's marked by the seasons. You've got the suns on her heels, the moon on her anklet, and the flowers and the rain clouds on the soles of her feet. So that wraps the picture. So I think that that primary objective of seeing how colored pencil or how colored line work could work in Procreate, I think was successful in this case. I really enjoyed it. It was a nice sort of casual way of working rather than sort of the typical color blocking, which you see in so much digital work. And I encourage you to try it too. If you have any questions, technical questions or more, any comments, feel free to leave them down below. You can subscribe, and we'll see you next week.